Battle of the Network shows. Join Rick Brooks and Mike Kogel as they explore the TV of the 70s and 80s through hand-picked episodes of their favorite and not-so-favorite series.
Welcome to a Battle of the Network Shows bonus episode. I'm Mike.
And I'm Rick. Hello, everyone.
And I'm going to let Rick explain this particular bonus episode. I don't know. Is this a List-o-rama? What are we going to... This is a special list.
It could be. I thought it might be fun to go through, in particular, the 1980s. I think that was probably our prime TV watching years because we were a little young in the 70s to do this maybe. But I thought it'd be cool to go through and determine what was our favorite network each year of the 1980s. So we're talking PBS, we're talking ABC, we're talking CBS, we're talking NBC, and Fox came along at the end of the decade, so they would be eligible as well. So when I did this, I included, kind of everything. I tried to do a broad canvas, and I will also say that I probably spent way more time thinking about this than I should have. I took it maybe a little too seriously, but
okay.
I thought it was important to get it down for the record. I deliberated over a few of these, but actually some of these, it wasn't close at all. There were a few... Yeah. There were tough calls, but at a certain point, one network might have run away with things a little bit.
Yeah, I could see that. Well, I don't think I took it quite as seriously as you did, but I did put it in table format.
Ooh.
With the year in column A, the network in column B, and a few notes in column C.
Wow.
And I did it doesn't sound like you did this, but I separated Saturday morning out into its own parenthetical.
Ah, interesting.
And I stopped at 85.
Okay.
I was done by then.
I did not do that, but I could probably speak to that because I included that as part of my deliberation. So I didn't formally separate it out, but it's fresh enough in my mind that I could probably speak to it.
Okay.
So should we start with the first year of the decade? Nice round number, 1980. Mm-hmm. Would you like to go first, or?
Sure, I'll go first.
Okay.
I chose NBC.
Interesting.
And I'll tell you why. I'll just list a number of shows here. Your Buck Rogers, Different Strokes, Facts of Life, BJ and the Bear, Sheriff Lobo, the Disney Sunday Show, Chips, and something I abbreviated as RP, and I'm forgetting what that is.
Real People?
Real People, yes.
Boy, this is really prestige TV, Battle of the Network shows style, huh?
And I will say that I think almost every year, as I looked through, I could see at certain days, oh, that's a CBS day, or this is but overall, NBC certainly won the day that year. But for Saturday morning, I put ABC, which at the time seemed to have the strongest amount of stuff. It had Superman, or Super Friends, and I think Thundar, and pretty solid. That wouldn't really last, but as far as my choices, but... That year, and these were definitely shows that I can remember watching and talking about, and as much as at some point I was watching like Alice or something, I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
Again, like we talked about, when that was reruns and when that was actually on air. Clearly, CBS had some shows, though, the Hulk and the Dukes of Hazzard type shows. It was in the running. I think ABC might have been in the running with your Happy Days and some of that. NBC for me.
Interesting. And we've talked about a lot of these shows that you've specifically mentioned. Maybe there's a couple that we haven't gotten to yet, but it does seem appropriate, and maybe it would help explain why you, as well as, and I do too, have a sort of a certain affection for, NBC in this era, as we've mentioned many times in the podcast. Yeah, I can definitely understand your thinking. However, I will point out, my good friend, that, as you know, there's a slight but not insignificant age difference between the two of us. And I think this is the year where it maybe comes into play a little bit. Because, personally, I don't really remember watching a lot of primetime television in this year. So for me, while I agree with you on Saturday morning, ABC, I think, all the way, led mainly by the Super Friends, also some things like Plastic Man, and even like the Richie Rich kind of shows. I do remember watching them, and I actually also remember watching American Bandstand in the early 80s on Saturdays. So for me, Saturday mornings was ABC, but overall, I picked PBS. And for me, I was at the age where Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, they were still big parts of my life. I think 3-2-1 Contact was starting up. Electric Company was in reruns at the time. I don't think they were making new episodes. But so for me, those were shows that meant a lot to me at that time. And I think they probably meant more to me than anything like in primetime. So for me, primetime wasn't as big a factor in 1980. So that's why I went with the public broadcasting system, PBS. Though I also match you on ABC for Saturday mornings, and PBS on Saturday mornings. Who knows what that was? That was kind of a wasteland for me. But based on the strength of their weekday lineup, I go with local station Channel 3 PBS. And also, I will also mention that there are other shows that were on, like if I was sick or something like that and staying home and like, in bed with a cold or something like that, or, whatever young kids have, when they're sick, whooping cough. I don't know what I had, but I remember watching just kind of like some of the weird shows that aren't as well remembered as Sesame Street. That would kind of be like a default if I were just kind of like zoning out watching TV. A lot of it would be the child appropriate PBS shows on the weekday. So that's my pick.
Okay. Very interesting. And one thing we're not factoring in too is is whatever local channels we're showing. So,
correct.
A certain amount of my watching was like the TBS cartoon block or reruns on TBS and other channels like that. Although we're just before the era of the syndicated cartoon boom.
Right.
At that point, it probably was just Scooby-Doo reruns or something in syndication, or the Flintstones and the Jetsons on Turner or on TBS.
That's a good point. If we were including my beloved New York local stations that I got, even though I wasn't in New York, this would be a much, much more difficult exercise.
Right.
But, maybe, if people enjoy this, maybe someday we could do something including like cable or stations that you would get maybe with your cable dial. Like for me, we obviously did pick up New York stations with an antenna. It was because they were on our cable system. Then you can include TBS, USA, all those things. So, but good point.
And this was a strike year, right?
1980 into 1981. Yes. Although I think there was another strike. I think this was
right.
The writer's strike and was one year, and the actor's strike was the next year.
Yeah. Especially the 1980 schedule, I think, had some weird stuff in it.
Yeah, I think the writer's strike, was much more disrupted. I think 1980 was more disrupted by the strikes than next year.
As an aside, it was interesting to see how long That's Incredible was around a little longer than I thought, and apparently was a decent-sized hit for a while, at least winning its time slot. And
really, yeah. Off the top of my head, I would guess like maybe 2 or 3 seasons.
Yeah, I think it was at least 3,
But I would have guessed like 2 seasons and maybe like 1.5 as like a real big hit, and then kind of like a really quick drop off.
Yeah, as they ran out of incredible things.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I guess we can move on to 1981.
Yes. Why don't I go first for 1981?
Okay.
You want to go back and forth? We'll
sure.
Alternate. Okay. For 1981, for Saturday morning, I think I would probably still go ABC. There wasn't a lot of change, I don't think, as far as my watching for Saturday morning. And on the basis of that and some other things, ABC was a strong number 2 for the overall choice. However, I picked CBS. And part of it going back is I think my favorite shows at the time were probably The Incredible Hulk and The Dukes of Hazzard. They were both on Friday nights. And I just remember loving those shows and just sort of being like disappointed maybe if I didn't see them. So they have strong memories for me. And so I'm kind of getting to the age at this point where primetime television means a little bit more to me. But also, I want to give some credit to the weekday lineup. A lot of times, I'm still young. I'm home, with my mom. My mom was a fan of Price is Right and Guiding Light, which was a CBS soap opera. So those 2 shows, well, I didn't really watch Guiding Light. I did watch Price is Right, but I remember them being on a lot. So kind of the CBS branding affected me a little bit more back then than it would later. So for me, yeah, CBS and a tough call over ABC.
Okay, well, I also went with CBS, partly because at least I think 3 of the shows on the NBC list had been canceled.
Ouch.
Buck Rogers, BJ and the Bear, and Sheriff Lobo, I think, were all gone by then. And interesting, I don't remember this, but I guess Disney moved to CBS that year to Saturdays, and then Dukes of Hazzard and Hulk, and I think by then the Jeffersons and maybe Alice too would have been shows I was watching. So, and probably some other things, but these are things that are standing out. Was that the year of Mr. Merlin?
Yes.
I mean, every year is the year of Mr. Merlin.
I think that was the year it premiered. Yeah, it might have been in the spring or something. No, I think it was in the fall. But yeah, I think it was 1981. And I remember Jeffersons and Alice as well, and I kind of associate them with kind of Mr. Merlin starting. So yeah, I would add those to the list of stuff I was watching at the time too.
For Saturday, I switched over to NBC. I think the Smurfs started that year, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, just a more solid lineup at NBC at that point.
Right.
Keeping in mind that I was still watching things on the other channels too.
Of course, yes.
Wherever Looney Tunes
Yeah, for me, I think probably my favorite show on Saturday mornings was Super Friends for a longer time than I realized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it might have been that it does seem like, although it bounced around the schedule a lot, some of these years I noticed it was on earlier. So it might be the kind of show that I would be, just have nothing else to do. And it might be easier for me to watch it rather than being outside or doing other stuff. So I was probably a Super Friends loyalist for quite a while, and that would really carry ABC for me.
So I think that's it. I mean, and some of that, as I've mentioned before, we were, in terms of the news, we were a CBS household at that point. I think that changed at some point, but, and 60 Minutes was on, and boy, of course I loved that.
Oh, of course. I wanted to ask you, did you happen to participate in a letter writing campaign, maybe to save Sheriff Lobo when it went off there?
No, unfortunately, my whatever grade, second grade class didn't, they were, I think we did do something. I don't know if we participated in a letter writing campaign to the hostages.
Ah, well, wow.
But I know that happened.
Really?
And I know at some point we did a thing where we tied letters to balloons and let them off. Kind of like a message in the bottle kind of thing.
Yeah, I wonder if any of those balloons reached Henry Winkler up in the Still the One balloon for ABC.
Boy, I would love to hear him, on the talk show circuit for Barry.
Yeah.
Mentioning that. Oh.
Maybe he still has a couple of crumpled letters, written in crayon that he carries around with him to remind him of why he does all this.
Yeah, it was from Georgia. I don't know how it got there.
I could just imagine him putting his thumb out and, maybe accidentally hooking a letter in a balloon with his thumb and just, hey, what's this? Checking it out.
Yeah, CBS. Way to go, CBS.
Yeah, well done.
What was their slogan again at the time?
We're the ones for the 2 to 11-year-old demographic.
Yeah. Okay.
We're like Recess. I think that was their slogan back then. That's why we love them so much.
They're tender like Recess.
Yes. Yeah. It might have been like we've got it all or something, or okay. I don't remember the catchy jingle off the top of my head, which is indicative of the ineffectiveness of that campaign. That might have been the Kenny Rogers years, maybe right around now.
Maybe,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got each other or something, or we've got tonight.
We've got. Of course, Magnum was in there at some point for a very long time in these eras. And I think in our episode about it, I wasn't sure exactly when I started watching it, but then I realized that I had at least seen it, by the time Matt Houston came along, because I, was watching Matt Houston and thinking it was a Magnum ripoff. So, yeah. Or somewhat, and it was on at 8 o'clock for a long time. So it's just, that's part of what makes his heart. There's all these other shows. You're like, oh, I watched that. I watched, at some point, like Wizards and Warriors shows up, and I'm like, oh, well, I was watching that.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily choose CBS that year, but I guess we can move on to 1982.
Okay, go right ahead.
And for the third straight year, I'm switching networks.
Ooh.
And now it's ABC's turn. And some of the shows that I think I was watching then, Greatest American Hero, The New Odd Couple.
What?
I distinctly remember watching it.
Yes, I did too, but...
Benson.
Uh-huh.
And I've got a couple abbreviations. I've forgotten what they mean again. TGM.
TGM, the Games Master. The
so.
weekly Dungeons and Dragons tournament. Oh, I know what that is, because okay. I had mentioned it for mine. That's Tales of the Gold Monkey.
Oh, yeah.
Which was like a new show that didn't last very long, but boy, I loved that show when it was on.
I did too, yeah. And then that cleared my head about the other one, which is The Fall Guy.
Ah.
And then...
I'm glad you didn't make me speculate on what TFG stood for, because that could have gotten us in trouble.
Well, luckily I just said FG. Well,
okay. Well, yeah.
A couple shows I know I watched, and yet it seems like they were on too late for me to have been watching. But they were Friday night. But Renegades and The Quest.
Ooh.
So, wait, no, I didn't watch Renegades. No. Renegades is the thing with Patrick Swayze, right?
Yeah, I think Renegades was one of our early TV guide game subjects. Was it?
Yes, yeah, that's right. I was thinking of the other thing, that the Miami Vice ripoff thing.
Oh, the Insiders.
The Insiders, yeah.
Yeah.
Boy, I clicked on the Insiders description on Wikipedia last night, and that description did not do it any justice.
No.
It was just like it sounded like it was about newspapers.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the show didn't deserve much justice, to be fair.
Yeah. But the quest was the sort of like, what do we call it? International scavenger hunt kind of thing with Perry King and others.
Yes, so, I did not watch that.
And the Saturday morning was again NBC for pretty much the same reasons as before. I did have asterisks again. So there you go. for 1982 for me.
Very well explained, and I think that's a good illustration of why the 2 to 11-year-old demographic is so coveted by Madison Avenue, because, it's volatile. You're often changing your opinions, and it's tough to reach that audience. And you're a good example, switching networks here for the first 3 selections. But you know what? I think I'm going to switch again myself, because I went with ABC for 1982. And Tales of the Gold Monkey was a good mention, and this was kind of like the tail end of shows like Happy Days and Three's Company, but I'm pretty sure I was watching those at this time, in prime time, as well as in reruns probably. And also, I went with ABC for Saturday morning again. Again, the strength of the Super Friends and the Richie Rich and some of those combinations of shows they had. I think Gary Coleman was on this year, I noticed, on NBC, and I kind of wish I had watched that every week, but I don't think I did. And even Spider-Man, I think Spider-Man, I was watching that heavily a little bit later. And I'll also mention that it seems to me like the comic book ads for the Saturday morning lineups that really stood out to me are the ABC ones, especially like with the caricatures of, Fonz and the Happy Days gang and Laverne and Shirley and Mork and Mindy and those. So maybe that's kind of influencing me a little bit. Although I do remember Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends being advertised a lot. But so here, Saturday morning really boosted ABC a lot. Kind of a drop off with some of the CBS stuff as well. And this is the first year I think I really was into the Love Boat Fantasy Island combination on Saturday night. So that's also a big choice, or a big part of my choice of ABC for 1982. It had been there before, but 1982, this age, I'm pretty sure on Saturday night, if I'm not out partying, I might be staying home and watching Love Boat Fantasy Island, that Dream Team lineup on Saturday night. So yeah, ABC, and it was a little bit easier for me than CBS over ABC the year before. I think ABC is a solid number 1 for 1982.
All right. So maybe not still the one, but the one for that year.
It was for me.
Both of us, yeah.
Yeah, now the one.
So I believe it's your turn to start 1983.
Yes, and I'm going to keep it kind of short here. I don't think there was a huge amount of change for me, but one thing came into play for me in 1983, and that's kind of leading to my selection here. I went with NBC, and the one thing that I think was happening around this time was I started getting into sports, more like sports on TV specifically. And NBC had Major League Baseball Game of the Week on Saturdays, and also I can remember like watching college basketball on NBC, and they early 80s around this time, and they weren't like really a huge college basketball network even, and I think they'd be showing like kind of sort of random games like DePaul and Notre Dame and things like that, not even necessarily the top games, but I just liked them and I liked their NFL coverage. That probably mentioned the podcast before with like Dick Enberg, Merlin Olsen, and those guys. So, and college bowl games, I'd watch, the Orange Bowl was one of my favorite games to watch on NBC. So for me, the big thing was sports, and plus we're starting to get into some more of like the primetime shows, like maybe something like Facts of Life, that I would have been watching now. And I think Different Strokes was still on around this time. So yeah, for me, I went with NBC for 1983.
And so did I.
Ooh, interesting.
For maybe some different reasons, but here's a sample of shows I might have been watching. The A-Team, Riptide, which I didn't watch as much as my brother did, but, I watched it some. I think I might have started watching Family Ties by then. The Master, which, of course, we've talked about. The Duck Factory, which was a sitcom about a cartoon company.
Wow.
Which Jim Carrey's on that, right?
Correct.
And one of the classics of all time, Mr. Smith, the talking orangutan show.
Of course.
And another classic, and for a while, ratings juggernaut, TV's bloopers and practical jokes.
Yeah, yes.
I did not, I guess I could have gone with ABC because Fallops, Bleeps, and Blunders, but, they didn't have practical jokes.
Yeah, that was a big minus.
They did have Don Rickles, but... So, and Saturday I stuck with NBC, which was pretty close to the same schedule as the previous year.
I don't think we mentioned Silver Spoons. Did either of us mention that? That would have been one I was watching at this time as well. And also, I'm glad you mentioned Bloopers and Practical Jokes. I had that written down actually as one of the shows I was really watching the next year. But also around this time, Sale of the Century on NBC, I would have been watching that as one of my favorite daytime game shows. So that goes into the hopper as well. And as far as I don't think I mentioned Saturday morning, but I don't think there was much change. I think it was probably still ABC, but at this point, Saturday morning is slowly starting to become a little bit less relevant for me, I think.
You're maturing at a young age.
Yeah, well, that can't be it.
You're just going outside.
I do think like at this time would have been when I was probably watching Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends more. So NBC, and I sort of remember Smurfs always being on, but I don't really remember deliberately watching it. I seem to remember maybe just because nothing else was on, but so maybe at this point I was becoming more of an NBC guy on Saturday mornings. But
well, yeah, with Smurfs it was like 5 hours long, so you could kind of watch a little bit and then change channels.
Yeah. dip in and out.
Okay, so we're moving on to 1984, and I'm going to say the beginning of trend for me. I mean, I guess technically last year was, but NBC again. And granted, some of the shows from before Mr. Smith were no longer around, the master, but that's the year the Cosby Show showed up.
And everything changed.
Everything did change. So, and Family Ties and many of those other shows, I was still watching those. So I would say at this point I was becoming an NBC guy for sure.
Yep.
And Saturday I put ABC with a question mark. I think Spider-Man might have ended, and Super Friends is nearing its end, but trying out some new things. Like, I think it got interesting to me again. But we're almost near the end of my Saturday morning thing. So, but yeah, NBC.
Nice. Yeah, for me, Saturday morning didn't really, I don't think, had a strong influence. Not necessarily because I wasn't watching a lot of stuff, but I think my viewing was really scattered. One thing I know that I watched regularly was Pryor's Place, and that was on CBS, which we haven't really talked about with Saturday morning. But I think they were still showing Bugs and stuff, but I do remember watching Pryor's Place a lot, so I got to give it credit for that. And ABC's kind of falling off a little bit. NBC, I think, had Mr. T at the time, so they're probably gaining a little bit in Saturday morning. But for me, I did pick NBC again, but in addition to a lot of the stuff you mentioned in prime time, really becoming a factor with not just Cosby Show, but Family Ties and Night Court, even, watching at this time. But for me, this is kind of when I think I started paying more attention to late night television and Saturday Night Live on the weekends. I do remember watching Saturday Night Live at about this time. This is when they still had Billy Crystal, Martin Short, and those guys. And I was watching David Letterman and even, Johnny Carson at times. So that plays into it for me. And, I think this is, we're kind of getting into the NBC, let's all be there. So that kind of the branding we talked about, the NBC, the slogans and stuff, I'm starting to identify that with that a little bit more. And also like sort of goofy shows that didn't last long, like It's Your Move and Double Trouble were around this time. And I do remember watching them when they were on. And Bloopers and Practical Jokes, which you mentioned for 1983. I remember it being really prominent in 1984 after having vanquished the Don Rickles, Steve Lawrence, Fallops, Bleeps, and Blunders. They're really at their peak right now, I think. So NBC is a strong number one for me. Number two would probably be ABC, partly because I really remember being into the Olympics that year. That was the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. That was a huge television event. And, some stuff, scattered stuff here and there. I think CBS would probably be a distant number three, and PBS, forget about it. We haven't mentioned them in a while. But yeah, NBC, easy number one here for me. And they're even adding shows that they're gonna stick around after this. But yeah, Cosby Show coming in, no doubt about it. NBC for me, 1984.
All right. Well, and this is what the folks at NBC wanted to see.
Yeah.
The kids at the edge of the 2 to 11-year-old demographic, transitioning into the next demographic. So 84, that would have been my end of the 2 to 11-year-old time frame.
Yeah, a lot must have been changing at that time.
Yeah.
Were you conscious of getting ready to go into another demographic?
Yeah, and I probably didn't want to go.
Yeah.
Hence why I'm going to have one more year of Saturday morning. But I believe it's your turn first.
Okay, well, all right, 1985. Speaking of Saturday morning, something came along for me really this year that changed everything as far as Saturday morning. And that was my love of professional wrestling, which made Saturday mornings for me all about the sport of champions, professional wrestling, and whatever I could get on Saturday morning. There were a couple shows around this time that would be available then, or at least, even into the early afternoon. So the cartoons became even less relevant to me, and Saturday night's main event debuted on NBC in the, of course, 11:30 p.m. time slot on Saturdays. Like every 6 weeks or so, we did a whole episode of that way back. So that was one of my favorite TV shows at the time. So for me, it's NBC again. And also this year is when I kind of think it became just kind of like really NBC, like as far as like becoming a Tom Brokaw household. Not so much that it was on all the time, but I thought of Tom Brokaw as the guy for like, breaking news, or just if nightly news was on, it would be NBC. And also the Today Show. I think probably it was more my mom's doing, but I think if morning shows were on, it was more Good Morning America. I think, she kind of liked David Hartman and was like in Joan London probably. But around this time, I kind of remember, okay, it's Bryant Gumbel, Jane Pauley, and the Today Show just seems like the bigger deal. So that's before we even get into prime time, and we've got, Miami Vice and Cosby again, Family Ties, all kinds of things. I suspect you might have some things to say about this same network, so I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, NBC, big winner for me in 1985.
Yeah, I'm sticking with NBC, and again, Cosby and Family Ties, and I might have dropped off the A-Team, by then. But I think by then I was starting to watch like Cheers and Night Court, possibly.
Yeah.
It might still be a little early, but I think so. So in general, I think, yeah, NBC was the place to be. Wait, no, that's a different network. That's the place to be, right?
Yes.
Oh, it's so confusing. Yeah. And Saturday morning, went back to NBC for the last year. I think, things like Gummy Bears and Shirt Tails. Shirt Tails is certainly better than the inferior Get Along Gang.
Ooh.
Even if they came from the same American Greetings source.
Wow. I'm glad you're coming out hard today with these, but you got to make a stand.
Hey, any cartoon that introduces kids to the Humphrey Bogart, he gets a thumbs up, right?
Well, I can't argue with that.
Even if it's in monkey form.
Yes.
Anyway, NBC, and I don't have much else to say. Somewhere in there, Misfits of Science came along in one of those years, and I remember watching that. Powers of Matthew Starr was in there at some point.
And I think this is kind of like a sign of maybe an attachment to a network that you can remember, like shows that were, be considered pretty big failures. But, you have memories of watching them because you just... Maybe you like the show, but you might be more inclined to give it a chance or to watch in the first place just because it was on the network that you were watching anyway.
Yeah, that's true. And you got all the ads for it,
Yeah.
Hyping you up. Misfits of Science, they're targeting those Cosby Show fans.
Yeah.
Probably, and getting 5 of them. But,
yeah. Yeah, if they would have gotten 5%, they might have lasted longer, but...
Yeah. Literally 5. That's not going to help. Yeah, so I guess we're moving to 1986 now, and I'm going to throw in a little curveball, which I hope is accurate. I switched to ABC for this year.
Ooh, interesting.
Yes. And can you guess what show above all others might have caused that switch?
Who's the boss?
Nailed it. Correct night. Yeah, Moonlighting. Like this was peak Moonlighting, right?
I would think so.
Second season, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking...
Again, I don't think I was probably watching it more in the 87 portion of this season, but that's definitely when that happened. And a lot of the sitcoms that were on, possibly including Who's the Boss and Growing Pains. Head of the Class, I think, started that year. And the Benson-Webster juggernaut, or even better, I think maybe the Benson-Webster Mr. Belvedere.
Oh.
I mean, what a combo.
Yeah. I think for a while they called it Can't Miss TV. And, they didn't quite have it, but they had the programming, but they didn't quite have the slogan to match it yet.
Yeah. TGIW.
Yeah.
Thank God it's Webster. Yeah, a little switch up, but I'm still watching all that other stuff on NBC, though. So it's a tough call. But
yeah.
I needed some variety in there, I think.
Well, for 1986, this is kind of like, I believe it's Alan Hunter on the VJ Big 40 Countdown on Sirius XM, who refers to, I think he says like 84 to 86 is what he calls the sweet spot of the decade. And I certainly think that's the case for me. And 1986 is kind of the last year I think of as really the high point of the 80s, although I'd kind of extend that maybe to 1983 as well, personally. But this is kind of the last hurrah for me of like primetime TV really being, a cool thing. But I went with NBC again. For me, Miami Vice and Crime Story were a potent combination on Friday nights. The Thursday night lineup was still going strong. Cosby was still, something watched most every week. Probably watching a little bit of the A-Team at that point, and Saturday Night's Main Event still going strong. And a lot of the other stuff I've already mentioned, like news being a factor, Sale of the Century still being on in the daytime, when I'm around to watch that, and Saturday Night Live still being a thing. So for me, maybe a little bit of competition. Moonlighting is a good one. Surprisingly, just looking back, CBS really not that big a factor right now. ABC, some of the shows like Head of the Class you mentioned, Sledgehammer, I really liked that. And I was probably, I think I was watching Perfect Strangers about this time too, but I wasn't really that attached to these shows. So for me, it's still definitely NBC. And again, I'll mention like the sports is probably a big thing for me this time, kind of making me more loyal to NBC. So yeah, this is the fourth year in a row I pick NBC for 1986.
And yeah, so your love-hate relationship with Perfect Strangers began?
Yeah.
Or your indifference-hate relationship?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I was angry with the way they utilized Bronson Pinchot after, how he was used in the Beverly Hills Cop or what, but I do remember watching it. So yeah, it was there.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the other shows you mentioned too, I do would have had them on from time to time. And also, there were younger kids in my household at the time as well. Not mine, siblings, of course. I mean,
right, yeah.
But so that might be influencing kind of family TV viewing and everything like that. But again, just not as important to me as something like a Family Ties or a Cosby Show or even Cheers at this time.
Okay, well, and what did you have for 1987?
Well, I don't have a lot specific. I picked NBC again, and as I mentioned, I'm really starting to see a big drop off now. And some of the shows that I mentioned earlier, like Cheers and probably even Night Court, I think, are more important to me now than they were even a few years earlier. We're kind of past shows like Give Me a Break and things like that. So I think there's probably less shows I'm watching. ABC would probably be coming in as a strong number 2 at this point. But for me, primetime's not the story. It's kind of more of these peripheral areas like, weekend programming, Saturday Night's Main Event still being one of my favorite shows, and the sports, particularly NFL and Major League Baseball on NBC. So yeah, NBC is the choice, but looking back, I surely wasn't as passionate about it as I would have been, like the previous, 3 or 4 years.
Well, I switched back to NBC for 1987, and I didn't really put any notes about that, but, again, you got your Cheers, you got your Night Court.
Mike, can I ask you a question? I hate to interrupt, but a show that was on around this time, and maybe you're going to mention it soon, but I'm just curious because it's something that we haven't talked about. Were you into MacGyver around this time?
I watched it occasionally. I was never too into it, though.
Yeah, I asked because I think at my school, or like, kind of my age group, MacGyver was pretty big at the time. Or at least, like, people would talk about it. I never really got into it, though.
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching it a little bit, like, and encountering Bruce McGill for possibly the first time. But,
Ooh.
And then Dana Elcar, whose name I recently saw as a director of a show that I don't know if we'll ever talk about, but I'll tell you later.
Okay.
And, but it seemed goofy. I think sometimes, was it ever on Mondays, maybe? Like before football?
Before Monday Night Football, yes, I think you're right.
Yeah. So I seem to remember maybe my dad or brother watching it before that, but not a huge fan. Sorry, mullet fans.
Hey, by the way, can we pitch Encountering Bruce McGill as a reality show? Because I would like to see that.
As long as I don't actually have to be in it.
Yeah, fair enough.
I don't know if it might be too much to deal with in person.
Right.
Sticking with NBC, and I'll go ahead and move into 1988 and say I stuck with NBC again. And I should actually go back to 87, 88, and that's the year I started to get into that late night stuff that you mentioned. So Letterman and SNL and The Tonight Show, all of those, at least in the summer. And I think, was it the summer of 88 was that big writer's strike?
Oh, I don't remember offhand.
It was around that time anyway.
Yeah.
Because I can remember like watching, those Letterman shows where he didn't have writers.
Oh, yeah, like Network. Was it when he started like the Network Time Killers or?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. But 1988, NBC had, of course, a lot of the stalwarts we mentioned and Dear John.
Oh, man. I love that you mentioned that, Mike, because I'd written that one down specifically.
Uh-huh.
That was a factor for me too.
Yeah, that was really, especially when it was on Thursdays as part of they weren't calling it must see TV yet, were they? But it was already that Thursday night was already NBC time. So yeah, sticking with NBC, and I like that you mentioned their baseball because I did watch a fair amount of their Saturday baseball stuff around this time with Costas and Garagiola and Tony Kubek, right?
Yeah, he worked with
Vince
Costas a lot.
Yeah. And they did the playoffs too sometimes, right?
Yep. And this was one of the famous World Series. I think this is the last year that NBC actually had the World Series.
Just the Dodgers?
Yes, the Kirk Gibson.
Right.
One of my favorite, moments in a World Series, Kirk Gibson's home run. And next year, ABC would have, because 1989 was the World Series, the Earthquake Series.
Yeah.
Bay Area one, so yeah. So it was a time of transition for NBC, for sure.
Was it a time of transition for Rick Brooks?
It was not a time of transition because I chose NBC as well. And kind of more of the same. Thursday night lineup being huge and not a whole lot of interest in other shows that were on. And I think I'm going to kind of leave it at that because I think some of the other stuff that I could mention, I want to mention in the next year. So if you want, Mike, I could just move us into 1989.
Go for it.
Okay, 1989, I picked NBC again. And I was actually tempted to go with Fox around this time, and maybe even before that, because Fox had Gary Shandling, I think, in Married with Children. Tracy Ullman was right around this time, I believe, 1989, starting up. So Sunday nights was definitely Fox for me. But I can't pick a network based on, just one night. There was so much other stuff going on still on NBC. And one thing that I'll point out that we haven't really mentioned, I mentioned Golden Girls earlier, but I think in that 8 o'clock hour, kind of around then, they would show Amen and 227. And I kind of remember that being a go-to. For some reason, I remember, if I was on vacation or something like that, and, it was Saturday night and maybe exhausted after, being at Disney World or something, you're at the hotel, hey, NBC's got Sherman Helmsley and Marla Gibbs, why not just kind of watch them? So I want to give them some credit for those Saturday night shows, along with Golden Girls, kind of lasted maybe a little bit longer than I would have thought, and kind of were more of a Saturday night thing for a while. And just a lot of the other stuff, some of the shows around this time, like Wonder Years, I would have been watching that. But some of the really big hits, like Roseanne, I just never watched that show. So some of the things that were very popular on the other networks, I just wasn't into those. So for me, I'd have to go with NBC. But I will say, around this time, maybe even 88 and 87 too, if we had extended this to include other channels, NBC's dominance would have ended, I think. But if we're confining ourselves to the 4 broadcast networks, it's NBC for me. And once again, in 1989.
Well, I may be breaking the informal rules of this, but I actually have a tie for 1989.
Ooh.
NBC and ABC. So NBC, I don't have to explain. I think we've explained that enough. I doubt I was watching Cosby by now, but again, Cheers and Night Court and Dear John, and things like that. And ABC had, you mentioned the Wonder Years, which I probably was watching by now, and Twin Peaks. I mean, it's one show, so but the amount of time I spent, watching that was appointment television there. That was a water cooler show, because at my high school we stood around the water cooler.
Oh yeah, okay.
And talked TV, yeah.
Right, right.
Every classroom had a water cooler, and we stood around it and talked TV before. In junior high it was a pencil sharpener.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Right, but high school. I can't deny how important that show was at the time to me. I'll go with that. NBC/ABC, and of course, Full House.
Of course, Natch.
Twin Peaks and Full House.
Yeah, what a combination.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I did watch some Full House early on, but it wasn't important in the way Twin Peaks was.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. I did not watch Twin Peaks at the time, really. I was aware of it, but I do remember that people who were into it were really into it, and the show had buzz. But it kind of illustrates, for me at this point, I had shows I watched, but not shows I was so passionate about. And it would probably be, a few years until I would get back into that. It was probably maybe Cheers was a show that I hated to miss. But, you might consume that in a different way than you would Twin Peaks, where there's, it's serialized. Although, Cheers was actually kind of serialized for a while too, but you know what I mean. For me at this point, there just wasn't a lot that I was super interested in, and I guess it would last a while. It's just primetime television was not as important to me, and probably in that factor would be just kind of being, again, watching a lot of sports in primetime when I might otherwise be watching network shows. If I'm watching TV, I might have it on baseball or basketball or something like that. So I don't think I had a Twin Peaks around this time.
Well, now some folks say that Cheers dropped the ball when they didn't go with the Who Killed Diane Chambers season.
Yeah, yes.
But, it seemed to work out in the end.
Yeah, they went their path. David Lynch went his path. And
right. Yeah, and I was watching a certain amount of college basketball and NBA basketball around this time. So wasn't always watching TV. So I understand that, but I didn't watch that stuff quite as much as you did, I don't think.
Yeah, you know what, though? The more I look at it again, I think the shows that I really liked and cared about most might have been, The Simpsons was started up in 1989. Mm-hmm. And Married with Children, and some of the Fox shows in Living Color. I watched that a lot. So, again, I'm tempted to say Fox, but there just wasn't, it just didn't feel like a complete network to me still. But some of the individual shows, like Simpsons, I remember just when that debuted, that was okay, this is a show that, have to watch every week, even if they put it on against the Cosby Show. So that would probably be the shows I was most passionate about, were some of those shows. And, Gary Shandling was in its tail end, I think, on Fox then. So for me, yeah, probably more Simpsons and Living Color. Married with Children were really big for me about this time. And, given I was a teenager, so probably not surprising.
Mm-hmm. Going back to Twin Peaks, and I think we're in agreement on The Simpsons a little bit about this too, and I guess, Seinfeld premiered in the summer of '89, maybe. But I would consider all of those kind of '90s shows because I think Twin Peaks didn't actually premiere until the 1990 part of that season. Anyway, we might not be talking about any of those.
Yeah, I agree.
And The Simpsons, of course, didn't really maybe completely find its voice for a couple seasons.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Although, I think that right from the beginning, The Simpsons was so different than anything else on TV that for me it was head and shoulders above most of what else was on already. So while it may have peaked like maybe a couple seasons later, I think right from the get-go it was one of my favorites. But yeah, I think that's fair to say. And yeah, I certainly don't think of Twin Peaks as a 1980s show, and Seinfeld definitely not. And I do have to. It does give me pause to think, that those shows might have actually technically debuted in 1989, but I don't think of them as 80s shows at all.
No, I mean Twin Peaks I think of, of course, outside of regular time.
Yes.
But it was part of the early 90s, a zeitgeist.
Right.
Okay. NBC was a big winner here, I think.
Yeah.
Even in some of their darker times.
I think I specifically mentioned it more. For me, like some of the promotional stuff and maybe the outside primetime stuff mattered a little bit more to me or had more of an impact. But, both of us had a lot of NBC shows that really meant a lot to us. And yeah, overall, that's kind of the network I associate with the decade, really.
Okay. Hopefully wherever he is now, Brandon Tartikoff is happy.
Yes.
Happy to hear this. Yeah. Job well done.
Yeah. If you'd like to hear us, expand this to, or maybe do something separate with cable networks and stuff, let us know.
Sure. At mailbag at battleofthenetworkshows.com or at our Facebook group on Facebook.
And, either place, but especially on our Facebook group there, because we have a nice discussion going on. I'd be interested to hear what some of our friends in the group and our listeners have to say about what their favorite networks were in these year. And did you even think about that? I mean, we're kind of doing it in retrospect, but I'm also kind of putting myself into that time frame. And I think I did clearly have like favorite networks for many of these years. Did you guys think about that? And, if so, what did you think at the time? Or even what do you think now? What were your favorite networks now that you look back at this with your perspective now? What do you think?
Yeah, that would be awesome. If somebody was a PBS diehard, I think we want to hear that.
Yes, I would be curious to hear that.
Yeah. Any network that was showing Wall Street Week was really nailing that 2 to 11-year-old demographic.
Yeah. Yes, Alex P. Keaton might have had, PBS. I mean, his dad worked for it.
Right.
Wall Street Week was on.
He probably had mixed feelings about it, though.
Yes, but also Firing Line would have been on there, too, right?
Oh, yeah. His political convictions might have not been in squared up with his notions of PBS.
That's true. I do think he said Wall Street Week was his favorite show, though, at one point.
Yeah, maybe being in that household gave him a different perspective then.
Yeah, it's true. He might have watched a lot of Dallas, and rooted for JR. I did a lot of armchair quarterbacking with how JR ran his empire.
Mm-hmm. It's just not good business to kill your sister.
Yeah.
I don't think he killed his sister, did he? Did he kill anyone? I don't know. His sister-in-law shot him, right? Spoilers.
Yeah.
Sorry, folks.
Yes. Well, there's something we'll have to get to someday, I think. Actually, we've mentioned a lot of shows that we will have to get to at some point. I think, this is kind of an interesting exercise to kind of look at some of the big hits of the decade that we haven't covered yet. So we have a lot of good ones to get to. But
the New Odd Couple.
Yeah.
Mr. Smith.
How we not?
Misfits of Science. Yeah. The Duck Factory.
Yeah.
Phallus, Bleeps, and Blunders. But more serious, I mean, I think I would talk about any of those shows, but certainly I think Dear John, that would be fun. And,
yeah.
Probably the Fall Guy. And Tales of the Gold Monkey is a bit of a question mark, but The Insiders.
The Insiders, yes, of course.
The Quest.
Mr. Merlin.
Mr. Merlin. Yeah.
Wow, we've really dropped the ball. I feel like we've let
QED.
let our listeners
we didn't even mention QED.
Yeah.
I know you put something on the website about
Yes. We've ignored many of these forgotten gems.
The Wizard.
Yeah.
Anyway, we go.
But we joke, but there's some shows that we've covered that did not exactly become primetime mainstays. So
that's true.
We have room for all kinds of television on this podcast.
And Wall Street Week. We gotta.
Yeah. Only if we can get to that economist Jerome from Tom Snyder's show.
Yeah.
Him and Wall Street Week would be an unbeatable combination.
Yes.
Right up there with Webster, Mr. Belvedere, and Benson.
Okay. We'll see you again soon.
Join us next time for another exciting episode of Battle of the Network shows. Learn more, leave feedback, and suggest future episodes at battleofthenetworkshows.com. Follow us on Twitter at BatNetShows, and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Battle of the Network Shows.